So this is the code we wrote in the last lecture to calculate the total number of shopping cart items. I have a problem with this implementation. Tomorrow we're going to add a new page where the user see all the items in their shopping cart. On that page, perhaps we want to display the total number of items in the shopping cart as well. With this implementation, we have to repeat all this logic, specifically these 3 lines inside that new component. So we need to refactor this code and move this logic where it really belongs. But here's the question. Where should we move this logic to? One way is to move it inside our shopping cart service and then use it like this. Shopping cart service that get total item count. We give it this shopping cart object and get the count. The problem I have with this implementation is that this will pollute our shopping cart service. Currently, we have a fair amount of code here. We have a bunch of different methods. We don't want to add additional unnecessary methods here. In object-oriented programming, we have a principle called information expert principle. This simply means the object that has the information about performing a task should be responsible for performing that task. I use a metaphor. Think of a chef. Chef has the knowledge about cooking. So we give the responsibility of cooking to chef, not to the waiter. We have the same principle here. So who has the necessary information about calculating the total number of items on a shopping cart? It's our shopping cart object. Look, because here we're referencing cart.items.quantity. So that information, that knowledge is inside the shopping cart object. So the most natural place to calculate the total number of items on a shopping cart is inside the shopping cart object itself. So I would rather, instead of adding this method to our shopping cart service, which looks procedural, define a property in our shopping cart like this. Cart, the total items count. This is much cleaner. We are not calling a method. We are not passing arguments. So let's go ahead and add this property in our shopping cart object. So here's the shopping cart interface. First of all, we need to promote this from an interface to a class, because here we want to add some logic. And we can't do that with interfaces, because interfaces are only about declaration. It's about what properties or what methods we have in a given object. The implementation is not defined in the interface. So here I want to define a property called total items count. Now, back to our component. This is the logic for calculating the count. So I'm going to cut this from here and move it here. Now let's make the necessary changes. So we don't need a field here in this class. I'm going to change this .shopping cart item count to a local variable in this property. Let's call that count. And of course, we need to define it. Now on line 8, instead of cart, we should reference this. And similarly, on line 9, this.items. And finally, we return count. So now we have a beautiful property that properly encapsulates the logic of calculating the total number of items in a shopping cart. And we can reuse this anywhere we're working with this shopping cart object. So back to our component. With this change, we can make this implementation much cleaner. Let me show you. So previously we defined the shopping cart item count here. With the new implementation, instead of defining this number here, we can define a shopping cart observable here and then unwrap it in our template. And there we will access this new property. So I'm going to delete this, define cart observable, which is of type observable of shopping cart. Okay. Now here we don't need to subscribe to this anymore because we're going to use the async pipe, delete. And instead of this local variable, we're going to work with our field. So this.cart observable. Isn't that better? Now let's go to our template. So navbar.html. This is where you're rendering our batch. So I'm going to add an ng if here. Get the cart observable, unwrap it with the async pipe, and store it in a variable called cart. And then we can access cart dot total items count. Much better. Now back in the browser, our batch is empty. The reason for this is because the object, the shopping cart object that we get from Firebase, that object does not have this new property we defined. So when we reference cart, the total items count, we get undefined here. So let's go back to our shopping cart service. Here is our getCart method. We have annotated this method with this type here, and this is simply to tell the TypeScript compiler that the observable that we get here is an observable of shopping cart. So the shape of each object in our observable is like the shape of shopping cart. However, that does not mean that each item in our observable is actually a shopping cart object. These are simple objects that we get from Firebase that only have properties defined in Firebase. So here, when we get this observable, we need to explicitly map it to our shopping cart object. Okay, so we apply the map operator. Let's make sure we have imported this on the top. We don't, so I'm going to import it here. Now, back to our method. So we get an object here. Now we want to map this object to a shopping cart object. So we return a new shopping cart object like this. Now we have a compilation error because what we return from the map method is an observable of shopping cart. However, our method is annotated with promise of Firebase object observable, not the standard observable. So whenever you use the map operator, because this is part of the standard RxJS library, you will get a standard observable. So here we need to change this annotation, and instead of Firebase object observable, use observable. Let's import this on the top. So back here, we create a shopping cart object. Now I want to pass all the items that we get from Firebase in the constructor of this class. So like this, X, then items. This way we can initialize this shopping cart object in one go. So now we need to define a constructor in this class. So shopping cart, I add a constructor that takes items, which is of type shopping cart item array. Now we can make this code simpler. We apply the public keyword here, and this will automatically initialize the items field. Now we have this compilation error because we have defined the items field twice. So let's delete this line. And this is our new shopping cart class. So let's test the application. So currently I have 2 items in the shopping cart. I'm going to remove the spinach. Now I have 1 item. I'm going to remove the bread. 0 items, beautiful. And let's add a couple of breads again. Okay, perfect. So our new implementation is working beautifully, and we can reuse this logic in the future when we build our shopping cart page.